pre-show quid pro quo. Zoe, you get one question. Go ahead, ask.
What is your biggest pet peeve?
My biggest pet peeve. I don't have very many of them,
What?
if not any at all.
What?
I think if I had to have the biggest pet peeve, people who talk to you while they're looking at their cell phone. I think that's the one thing that really bothers me. Or people walking down the street with their cell phone. That drives me insane. And
Yeah.
I don't know why. It's a totally irrational pet peeve. But,
No, that's not irrational at all.
yeah, it's that really bothers me. Specifically, the people walking down the street thing. That really, I can't stand it. And I had a friend who would purposefully not move out of their way, and he would just walk into them, and then when they would look up at him, you'd just be like, "Oh, excuse me," and then keep.
I think I've done that sometimes.
Welcome to What Magic Is This, a podcast that wants to add a little audio to the witch bottle you call life. This is a podcast about magic, the occult, the paranormal, the supernatural, the weird, and other strange things across these fucking landscapes. So, I give my guests about 25 topics to pick, and then they get to choose one, and you chose one that is pretty well, I'm going to say it's a big one, and you chose consciousness. You also asked me, like, why don't you have astrology in the topic list? Like, what's going on? It's like, well, that's a little bit later on down the line. We'll get to astrology at some point. I guarantee everybody. But in some ways, I kind of regret not choosing astrology now. I really do. So. As far as the research for this has been by far the hardest episode for me to do research on. There's just too much to talk about with this topic. I thought, how am I going to get into this episode? How am I going to do this episode? What's it going to be about? Just the things that interest me or whatnot. So let's get right into it. So I was searching. Guess what, Zoe?
What is that?
I found the definition, and I've actually figured out what consciousness is.
Really?
I nailed it.
Okay, let's
All right,
hear
you
it.
ready?
Mm-hmm.
So this comes from a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, The Scientific Search for the Soul by Francis Crick. He wrote this book in 1994, and he says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So that's it. That's the episode, everybody. Thank you for listening to What Magic Is This? You can go to whatmagicisthis.com. Check it out. I've got Twitter links. I've got YouTube. I've got everything there. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Oh, bye, everyone.
I think that episode went great.
That was great.
Yeah, all right.
It's Francis Crick.
Francis Crick.
Francis Crick has all the answers, everyone.
Okay. All right. To be seriously here now. This episode is definitely going to be the most chaotic. It's because when we talk about something like consciousness, it's going to be all over the place. And as much as I'd like to make something very, very comprehensive, with this one,
Because consciousness is everywhere.
It's right. It is everywhere. So hang in there. We'll get there in the end together. Fingers crossed. So let's definitely dive in. We have Crick's definition, and that's kind of the one that most people go on. When people ask me what consciousness is, I like to bring up the anecdote when Louis Armstrong, some say it was Fats Waller, when he was asked what jazz is. And the reply was, if you got to ask, you're never going to know.
I like that.
Yeah. So consciousness is everything. Everything that we have is due to consciousness. Everything. It's without a way of perceiving things, without our vantage point. That's it. That's all we have. Conscious experience is the only reality that can be known. Period. To us. Well, what we can do is we can get into what is considered the hard problem of consciousness and conscious experience. So right after what is the meaning of life, there is which is a big question, probably the biggest one that we have, is the question of why are we conscious? And I think the two kind of go together in some way, very much so. The hard problem of consciousness is how and why do sentient organisms have phenomenal experiences? This comes from David Chalmers. He wrote a book called The Conscious Mind. He divides consciousness into two problems. There's easy problems of consciousness, which are scientifically observable. They're things such as brain processes. These are functionally definable, like the difference between being asleep and being awake. The hard problem has to do with experience. And although experience is associated with a variety of functions, explaining how those functions are performed, they would leave important questions unanswered as well. So we would still want to know why their performance, sleep, awake as an example again, is accompanied by an experience, and why this or that kind of experience rather than another kind of experience. And for a long time, at least basically since we've been unpacking this idea of consciousness, everybody's kind of tried to throw in their hat into the ring. People have a dualist nature. There's panpsychism, there's the materialist way of looking at things, there's Mysterianism, there's idealism, and people that are putting these ideas forward, they're all duking it out for the best chance of explaining what consciousness is. So if I was to ask you, where's consciousness? Where would you say it is?
Maybe it's possible that many people think that consciousness is situated somewhere in the body. Mm-hmm. I personally don't agree with that, but right. I feel like maybe that's what many people would say.
Basically, if you ask most people, they'll say the word brain. They'll say consciousness comes from the brain. I
definitely don't agree with that.
No. The prevalent view of consciousness now is that it is an epiphenomenon of natural laws and reality. So Francis Crick would be one of them. He would say that consciousness is just this epiphenomenon of the brain has somehow come, and we're stuck with it, and that's just what we have now. Brain equals mind, therefore consciousness.
So hold on a second. Brain equals mind. Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Most people, if you ask them, say, point to your arm, they point to their arm. And then with the other arm, say, point to your throat. They point to their throat and say, now point to your mind. Mm-hmm. Where do you think they would probably go?
I think most people would point to their head, but It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that mind is located there. Mm-hmm. Mind has anything to do with one's head.
Correct. Yeah. No, I'd agree with that for sure. But most people would point to their head. That's where we've been told where the mind is supposed to be. The brain, we do know that it does create some experiences, and it could explain to some point the hard problem of consciousness itself. And we have these tools, things like the EEG machines, and they measure brain states or brain signals. And apparently they say that these states themselves, that's where the experience is. That's where meaning comes from. That's where experience and apprehension of the mind occurs. And not long ago, they found that they thought was a natural correlate to brain signal correlate to which was supposed to be consciousness. They're like, we found it. We finally got consciousness. They called the signal it was called the P3B signal, and this was the conclusion that they had. It's like, we found it. We've got it. This is consciousness. But there's something that we have to remember, and that is it's the old adage that correlation does not mean causation. And I think a lot of people really don't get that. And suffice to say that the people that found the P3B, the relevance on it hinged on the fact that it was to show a totally conscious neural correlate. And that since then, and quite recently, it has been detected in unconscious brain processing as well, thereby making it null and void. So their inability to explain empirically or offer proof of consciousness even leads some neurologists and even philosophers to declare that there is no such thing as consciousness.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Daniel Dennett has just said there's no such thing. Okay. It just doesn't exist, right?
Interesting.
But here's the funny thing. If you were to ask these people, show me evidence, actual on a graph piece of paper evidence for consciousness coming from the brain, they have zero evidence. Mm-hmm. They never have. They've never even come close.
Of course.
Zero.
Yeah.
Nothing. And this is frightening. And that's why when you ask people, where does consciousness come from? The brain. And then you say, tell me more. Mm-hmm. They go, that's it. That's all they've got. With the whole idea of just, it comes from the brain. Oh, the brain obviously creates consciousness, and no, it doesn't. Well, then there's no consciousness. We can't explain it. There's no consciousness.
But the brain is just an organ.
When they say that the consciousness doesn't exist, they're just throwing all of their toys out of the pram at this point. So, but with all of these kind of things, physicalist, materialist notions towards consciousness, they just won't go away. For some reason, they just stick around, even though there's absolutely zero evidence. This metaphysics is just rife with what is called currentism, and which postulates that eventually they will. It's like we don't have it now. There's zero evidence now, but eventually we will come to the answer, and it definitely has to be in the brain. And someday everything will be explained, mind and consciousness, even the soul, eventually, when we understand the brain.
I have a question.
Yeah, for sure.
Are the soul and consciousness the same thing, and is the soul something that actually exists?
Well, it's kind of spoken of in materialist terms in almost the same way. This is like, well, people don't really think that they have a soul. Remember all those things like free will that Crick was talking about. It's all neural. It's like this stuff, the soul, the mind, this kind of stuff, that it's not there. It's just, it's epiphenomenon. To get back to the currentism that exists, there's a great book called Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, by a writer named, I believe it's Daniel Eagleman. And he talks about this currentism, and that eventually they think that science is going to be able to find out consciousness within the brain. And he uses a really good example. He says, this is his radio theory. Imagine that you were a Kalahari bushman and that you stumble upon a transistor radio in the sand. You might pick it up, twiddle with the knobs, and suddenly, to your surprise, hear voices streaming out of this strange little box. If you're curious and scientifically minded, you might try to understand what is going on. You might pry off the back cover to discover a little nest of wires. Now let's say that you begin a careful scientific study of what causes the voices. You notice that each time you pull out the green wire, the voices stop. When you put the wire back on its contact, the voices begin again. The same goes for the red wire. Yanking off the black wire causes the voices to get garbled, and removing the yellow wire reduces the volume to a whisper. You step carefully through all combinations and you come to a clear conclusion. The voices depend entirely on the integrity of the circuitry. Change the circuitry and you damage the voices. Proud of your new discoveries, you devote your life to developing a science of the way in which certain configurations of wires create the existence of magical voices. At some point, a young person asks you how some simple loops of electrical wire can engender music and conversations, and you admit that you don't know, but you insist that your science is about to crack that problem at any moment. Your conclusions are limited by the fact that you know absolutely nothing about radio waves and, more generally, electromagnetic radiation. The fact that there are structures in distant cities called radio towers, which send signals by invisible waves that travel at the speed of light, is so foreign to you that you could not even dream it up. You can't taste radio waves, you can't see them, you can't smell them, and you don't yet have any pressing reason to be creative enough to fantasize about them. And if you did dream of the invisible radio waves that carry voices, who could you convince of your hypothesis? You have no technology to demonstrate the existence of the waves, and everyone justifiably points out that the onus is on you to convince them. So you would become a radio materialist. You would conclude that somehow the right configuration of wires engenders classical music and intelligent conversation. You would not realize that you were missing an enormous piece of the puzzle. So in this situation, especially with materialist notions of consciousness, it's everything that you need to know is the stuff that you don't know. This is assuming that you were never going to wander out of the Kalahari, that you will never ever visit a big city. Everything that you need to know is stuff that you will not know. So, and also keep in mind this idea of the brain being a radio or a receiver. We'll talk about it in a little bit.
But that offers further proof that the consciousness is not in the brain if we're comparing it to be a radio.
The thing that really riles people up about consciousness, especially when we talk about things that are kind of on the periphery, things like psychic abilities or near-death experiences, or even things like ghosts. There's another great, and I promise this will be the last time that I read from a book or anything, but there's a great analogy by Jeffrey Kripal in a book called Changed in a Flash. He said, I often use an old analogy here. It goes back a few centuries to the early 19th century and maybe further still. Writers have long noted that shoving extraordinary phenomena into a conventional scientific box is rather like insisting that one can only study stars at noon, and telling us, obviously, no stars exist since none can be seen at midday. I would add one little twist to this parable. I would add that all the while we are told that there are no stars in the sky because we cannot see them at midday, we are also forgetting that the sun, in this analogy, our waking form of consciousness, including the form of consciousness that does the science, is actually a star. We are denying that there are stars, ironically enough, because such stars are completely outshined and temporarily rendered invisible by such a star. Materialism's inability to explain or offer any significant notion towards consciousness is a huge problem. It is extremely fallible because of its problem to come to any stance on the very thing that is everything in our experience of apprehension. So we are looking in the wrong place with the wrong metaphysics, and one which seemingly makes up its own rules and ignores most, if not all, notions that might show its short-sightedness. So let's step back a bit and even say, okay, well, what if it even does come from the brain? The question arises, well, how did we become conscious? We are still aware that there is some correlation between the brain and consciousness. There is a correlation, but it is not the cause of consciousness.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. So let's have a closer look. Do you know about the stoned ape hypothesis?
I do not.
No? Okay. So here goes. Defying all explanation, the brain of Homo sapiens sapien doubled in size over a period of 200,000 years. That might seem like a lot of time, but evolutionary, that is very short. How does this happen? Other Homo sapiens species, they started dying out within this 200,000 period of time, and until now, it's pretty much we're the only ones that are left. So try to think about when we first started to come down from the trees. What did we become? We became foragers for food. We had to find food. We were finding grubs.
We were living in the trees before?
Yeah, we were.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
I know.
Can we go back?
Well, some days I wish we would.
Seriously.
I love climbing trees. People say, let's go rock climbing. I'm like, no, I want to climb the trees.
Oh, totally, 100%.
Exactly. But we did have to forage for things. And what would we come across? We'd come across, again, grubs. We'd come across certain leaves and herbs. We'd come across mushrooms and fungi, right?
All the drugs.
That's right. So, and even when we did start to become what would be considered hunters, how would we find the animals in which we wanted to hunt? We would track them. And while we were tracking, what do animals that we're tracking leave behind? Poop. Psilocybe cubensis, which is a fungus, it grows readily out of dung. Extremely readily. Nice. Exactly where we would have been in Inner Africa at the time. And so while we're tracking these animals, we come across these mushrooms. They're edible. They look good. So what did we probably do? We probably had ourselves a little bit of a snack while we were waiting for the animal that we were hunting. And this probably happened not once or twice. It's not just like the smoking, like the one instance. We probably did this over tens of thousands of years.
So many visions from the mushrooms.
That's right. Absolutely. What's crazy about psilocybin is it substitutes as serotonin in the brain, which also activates neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is causing new brain pathways and brain neurons to form within the brain. And this is a well-known fact. This is actually what psilocybin does. What's crazy about this theory is that, of course, it can't be proven, but it is very eloquent in its ramifications. Like, imagine this entire speeding up where all other Homo erectus species started dying out. We did not. In fact, our brain did very well. It got much bigger in a very short period of time. So with this idea of the stoned ape, it could be the idea that we had these, they're drugs, but they helped our brains somehow gain more mass. They opened up new neural pathways that didn't exist, which is quite interesting. I don't think that this is the answer in any way, shape, or form, but it is one of the major parts of, I think, of how we became what we are with regards to consciousness. If we can think of, we have a passageway, and we're standing on one side of that as apes, and then at the other side was this idea of consciousness itself. I think this stoned ape hypothesis, it's not the passage that you go through, because it's never only one thing, but it is a part of this archway or this passage. And it may very well even be like the keystone of it, but we can't confuse it for the destination. We can't confuse this stoned ape hypothesis as the thing on the other side of the passage. It was as a gateway, but it was not the actual destination.
So King Kong figures out through eating mushrooms.
Generations and generations. King Kong's ancestors, King Kong's progeny, they eventually. But again, just a theory that we cannot, actually it's not even a theory, it is a hypothesis that we cannot prove. So And the other thing that I need to go through is Julian Jaynes and what's called bicameralism. And I have to go through this because last episode I completely butchered it to an extent where I'm actually very ashamed of it. Here's what it is. So what if consciousness is actually newer than we think? Julian Jaynes says that our brains were actually more separate than they are now. We know the brain that has the split in the middle, and there's a corpus callosum that runs down it. And this corpus callosum was actually much larger, and our brains were even more separate. It was like we had two brains.
Whoa.
Yeah. Put it in his book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. He says the intellectual life of man, his culture, his history, his religion, and science is different from anything else we know of in the universe. That is fact. It is as if all of life expanded to a certain point, and then in ourselves turned at a right angle and simply expanded in a totally different direction. So his theory was that the different sides of the brains, they acted completely differently. And one side of the brain was kind of like what we consider man, and which would be the left hemisphere of the brain. And the right side of the brain was what he called the God side of the brain. And he uses...
so sexist. No women at all.
Sorry. Not this time. The book was written in 1976.
But how was the man born?
Exactly. He uses historical texts as the background, and specifically the historical text of Homer's The Iliad. He says, when you read the Iliad, the actions of the characters themselves, they aren't the actions of the men. They are gods telling them to do everything. God tells them, or the gods tells them to do this. Their gods tell them to do this. And Julian Jaynes, and again, this is a really wild out there hypothesis. He thinks that at this point our brains were still incredibly separate. The gods take the place of consciousness. And he doesn't think this is a poetic device done by Homer and people back in ancient Greece. He said the two separate brains and the eventual breakdown of the corpus callosum allowed for the separate parts of the brain to communicate easier and more fluidly. So eventually we became our own gods. We took their place. This is a really interesting idea, and it is a model, as I mentioned last week, and not one that I totally go all in on. But modern theory speculates that something else happened. Well, Julian Jaynes, he can be applauded for his depth and his daring in this book. He probably got it back to front. It seems that the inverse happened. Not that separate brains merged, but that they actually drifted apart, almost like a Pangea or continental drift. He said there's phenomena that was previously uncomplicated, experienced as part of a relatively united consciousness, now became alien. This is from Ian McGilchrist. He says, where Jaynes interprets the voices of the gods as being due to disconcerting effects of opening a door between hemispheres so that the voices could for the first time be heard, I see them as being due to the closing of the door so that the voices or intuitions now appear distant rather than familiar, but alien, wise but uncanny, in a word, divine. Jaynes, again, he got it the inverse. It wasn't that our brains were completely separated. It was more that our brains were actually more together in their hemispherics, and then they started to drift apart.
It sounds like he's still very much linking consciousness to the brain.
Mm-hmm, very much so.
So
exactly.
I would like to get away from that
Let's
idea.
do it. Ask any person on the street, where's consciousness? They'll say the brain. Again, zero evidence. None. There is evidence for brain states and its relation to consciousness, but not consciousness itself. So where is it? Well,
is it located somewhere specific? Is it in the corner there by the radiator?
Could be under my plant. Could be.
Well,
if consciousness is everything, then it must be everywhere. This is what is known as idealism. And if you're interested in idealism, there's a writer who I've mentioned, I think, twice before on my podcast, is by the name of Bernardo Kastrup. There's also a podcast that, if this is your jam, you should definitely check it out after listening to this episode, obviously. Don't go right now, by Mark Gober. It was just released, I believe, in the last 3 weeks. It's called Where Is My Mind? And he goes into this very topic. If it's not in the brain, then where is it? I don't think this is the whole answer, but I like what idealists are doing it. So let's imagine that consciousness is like a stream. Right? And that in this stream there exists certain areas that are whirlpools. Now the whirlpool itself, what is it? It's composed of? It is composed of the same thing as it's water. It's still water. But what it is a concentrated, moving part of that stream. So if we're liking the consciousness to this flowing stream, the part that is a whirlpool, that's basically us. That's our little ticket on this consciousness. That's our little ride of consciousness. That's great.
So then are you saying with the stream analogy that when we die and the consciousness becomes part of the current, that the consciousness blends with other consciousness with like a kind of one universal consciousness?
That is the idealist contention, that it is, and it's kind of a little bit of a lazy monism. That it's mind and specifically consciousness. That is the fundamental property of the universe. You will agree, and you actually just brought it up, that here it is. The brain is the endpoint of the sense organs. So things like when people say like, well, I know it's part of consciousness because it comes from sense data. My sight, my taste, my smell, my touch. That these I get my sight from my eyes, I get my taste from my tongue. These are all sense organs. But what if the brain is just another sense organ, and that it's just the sense organ that receives consciousness? What if that's the whirlpool? That's the radio receiver that gets consciousness, and it's not the end point of the things that we're experiencing here on an experiential, phenomenal level here on Earth. But if we were to just talk about like for now, and again for how we say that our idea of consciousness is the ability to say I am. The experience that we're having here right now. Some people say it's a hologram, blah blah blah, but all this, but what we consider conscious experience while we're awake, right? Okay. Is mainly due to the sense organs that we have and how we move and navigate throughout the world, right? That is the contention.
I think, yeah, yes and no, because, and I mean, I don't know this for sure, but when you think about somebody who has brain damage or somebody who's maybe developmentally disabled,
right,
and maybe their brain doesn't function at the same capacity as the brains of other people,
right.
I wouldn't say that their consciousness is lessened.
No, absolutely not.
I would just say that we don't know that maybe their communication capacity is lessened. Therefore, we don't know, and so we make a lot of assumptions.
Savants. I forget the name of the gentleman who Rain Man was based off of. He had over 12,000 books memorized word by word. He could tap into this other thing that we do not have. And he would be considered, in other respects, he would be considered a complete vegetable if you were to just look at his brain. But he was great at so many things that we are not great at. So what does that say about consciousness itself only residing in the brains?
That it has nothing to do with the brain.
Exactly. So where consciousness comes from is the frontier of science. It is the next big thing that we are perhaps going to start to figure out. And what is required is just a real flip to occur. So let's get a little bit of distance. So what about us? How do we fit in? We know for a fact that we can't just look at something and be like, I want that stone to change into an animal. But we participate in the whole thing. And so let's look at how we participate. Let's talk about rainbows. Want to talk about rainbows?
I love rainbows.
Me too. So we see a rainbow. Mm-hmm. And the person next to us also sees the rainbow. Mm-hmm. And while it's there and while it lasts, we say that it exists in some small way, that it is in some way there. We can't go and we can't touch it, and unfortunately, there's no pot of gold at the very end of it. I'm sorry to break everybody's hearts.
What's the point of a rainbow?
I know. But we are there, and we are participants in the creation of the rainbow. Without the sun, and without the raindrops, and without our consciousness to perceive it, we do not have a rainbow. That is what makes a rainbow.
But are we all perceiving the same thing in the same way?
But again, the question is a rainbow really there? So and in a way it is, and it isn't at the same time. So let's talk about things that really are there.
Oh man. Okay, go for it.
So let's talk about, say, like a stone or a tree.
Or like the glass of water in front of me.
Delicious, delicious water.
It's great.
So again, we know what it is made out of. We know that it takes the rain. We know that it takes the sun, and we know that it takes a person. But what about a stone? It is there. You can go out and touch a stone, unlike a rainbow. And we know that, or we're told, that it is made up of molecules. So it's got atoms, it's got protons, electrons, and neutrons, and other smaller elementary particles. But there are huge gaps, at least in our understanding, there are huge gaps of space that exist within these elementary particles and within the protons and the neutrons and all the molecules. In a way, it is also not there at the same time. This solid object is a representation of something provided by my senses and provided by my consciousness. We are participating in it. So think about things this way. The raindrops are to the rainbow what the molecule is to a stone, and that we live in a world of rainbows. Everything is a rainbow.
I love it. Let's just end the podcast right here. Everything is a rainbow.
All things are representations of our consciousness participating in the making of this world.
Sure. I like that is much better than what we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And this was put forward by probably my favorite writer who talks about consciousness. His name was Owen Barfield. And he was born in 1898 and he died in 1997. He lived a very long life. He was an Inkling. Do you know who the Inklings are?
No, I'm just entertained by the fact that his name has the word barf in it.
Barfield. Oh, yeah. So the Inklings were a group of writers and poets based out of Oxford, and they had as their members C.S. Lewis.
Oh, cool.
And some other dude by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien.
What?
Yeah. So
the Hobbit? What?
Yeah. So these guys were not just your garden variety so-and-sos. They were the real deal. And Owen Barfield is kind of like the unknown Inkling, which makes him almost my favorite. There's a book called A Secret History of Consciousness that will go into the rainbows and whatnot. And it's a really great book if people want to try and understand more about the human consciousness. I say, if this stuff is interesting to you, please read it. It is great. And Barfield himself, he also talks, and unfortunately I can't go into it more detail for this podcast because he goes through language and how language was used in the evolution of consciousness. His books, History in English Language, as well as Poetic Diction, fantastic work. They're really great. But his book, Saving the Appearances, is by far his best. It's a small book. You can read it in an afternoon, and it goes through all the rainbow stuff. It is really, really great. So I'm going to try and not get into the whole Heisenberg and quantum physics or the uncertainty principle and how our vantage is what almost is able to have a co-creation in all of these things. But what I'm trying to get to in this state is that all we see in this world and all we sense is a representation of the particles. It is a representation of it. And it is not what the thing actually is, but how they seem to us now. And Barfield goes into the question is, what did the world even exist before we got here, before we had our consciousness to represent it?
That's a good question.
And science says absolutely. The volcano was there. Everything was exactly the same. The animals, they didn't know about anything, so they don't really count.
So the animals aren't
they're not
conscious beings.
That's what science is. Okay. But think about this: without us and our consciousness, how would these things have been represented?
Exactly.
And it's entirely baffling, and it's extremely fascinating. My favorite poet and artist at the same time is William Blake, and he put it more succinctly and more poetically than anybody. He says, where man is not, nature is barren. So imagine a world that was all rainbow, and then subtract one of its necessary elements, us. And that was the world before human consciousness. And it's tough to even think about. But it does bring up the really, really important idea that the physical world cannot be the cause of the consciousness that creates it. Do you get that? The physical world cannot be the cause of the consciousness that creates it.
Okay.
Yeah. So our understanding of these appearances, or even our apprehension of the things, is paramount to how we understand reality and the world.
I kind of like where you're going with this idea of appearances.
Yeah.
The rainbow is being an appearance, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it is there.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
it's not.
It's sure. What I kind of like to go back to, and what's interesting to me, is the fact that we're assuming the rock the rock is something that's there, and that it's more
Is it actually there?
that it's more solid than the rainbow, so to speak, because the rock is something that you can touch, you can feel, you know that it feels hard or smooth or jagged, and the rainbow is something in the sky and you can't reach it and you can't touch it, and so therefore somehow it is less there than the rock, that the rainbow is somehow an appearance, whereas the rock is not just somehow an appearance. I kind of like to go back to that idea and talk about why one is just an appearance and one seems more concrete than the other.
If you take a kind of like a 10,000 yard look at these kind of things, the table that we're sitting at right now has massive spaces in between it. It is almost as not there as it is there, in the sense that, again, I say we live in a world of rainbows. Everything is a rainbow. And our way of comprehending. And what it takes is going to take a massive, massive leap of us being able to get this fact into our heads. So the world we see is the way it is because of our consciousness is the way that it is. If our consciousness was any different, the world would be as well. Things, they are not as they have always been. There was the Cartesian split where we had the idea of mind and matter are two separate things. They're just completely different, and never shall the two meet, which was a necessary, but now, unfortunately, I agree with you, a now somewhat obsolete way of looking at things. Owen Barfield said that before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment. Men were not about it like a stage on which they moved. They felt themselves and the objects around them, and the words that expressed these objects immersed together in something like a clear lake of meaning. They were not separate from nature. They were nature, or maybe some other strange abstract idea. They didn't manipulate.
Sounds pretty hippie.
Yeah, they did not manipulate matter, but sought some kind of communion with it. And this is the evolution of consciousness, which I think we need to get to. So we cannot create reality. What we can do is be aware of the conscious process involved in participation. We have at least this awareness of the appearances. We know that there's clearly a reality outside of us. We do not create it, but we create the representations of it. And this is it. I'm going to say this twice. If the appearances are, as I have sought to establish, correlative to human consciousness, and if human consciousness does not remain unchanged but evolves, then the future of appearances, that is, of nature herself, must indeed depend in the direction that evolution takes. One more time. If the appearances are, as I have sought to establish, correlative to human consciousness, and if human consciousness does not remain unchanged but evolves, then the future of appearances, that is of nature herself, must indeed depend on the direction that evolution takes.
What does he mean when he says evolution? Is he talking about consciousness? Is he like what?
Yeah, the evolution of consciousness.
Is he talking about, like, when he says consciousness, is he talking about consciousness as like this one universal thing that is big, or is he talking about
specific human consciousness?
Yeah, because is consciousness one universal thing, or is it different for each person? Because do you, Doug, have a consciousness, and do I, Zoe, have a consciousness? And if that is so, do appearances then change based on your consciousness and my consciousness? So when we were talking about a few moments ago, this rainbow, well, you may perceive the rainbow in a certain way, and I may perceive the rain. Maybe I see two rainbows, but you only see one rainbow. So going back to what he's saying and this evolution, is he talking about this universal type of evolution, or is he talking about more of unique, distinct, separate evolutions depending on people?
I think he was going pretty broad. I think he was talking about specifically and unfortunately very human-based consciousness, because that's all he could apprehend, right? He was talking about. So
I agreed with him up to that point.
Again, he's speaking very broadly. He was trying to not talk about the specific individual. He was, again, there was that 10,000 step, like looking at things. So what is this direction that he's talking about? And indeed, what is this evolution? He saw the trajectory of the evolution of consciousness like a giant uppercase U, where it's one part, it's up above, and then it goes down below, and then it goes back up again. And he contends that we are now at the lowest point, and that
Maybe.
consciousness, that at the starting point, the very first part that you put on the pen on the paper to start uppercase U, that's how we began. He calls it original participation, where we were somewhat unified with nature, literally since the last 400 years. We're at the bottom of the U. So we need to move in a direction of what Barfield called final participation. So
I like this U analogy.
Yeah. So note that seemingly, I'm not saying that the endpoint isn't back at the beginning, right? We're not drawing a teardrop, right?
Sure.
The endpoint is further on than what it is, and this isn't an act of atavism. We're not trying to get back to this pure, but we need to try and find this final participation, and it is not going back to an earlier way of doing things. That would be like that would be impossible, basically, from what we know now and with what metaphysics we have now. We can't get to that point. But I think inevitably it will be with the adoption of an idealist model of this, that there is this consciousness that is all pervasive, that it is this universal mind almost.
So what is it? What is the universal mind that's all pervasive?
Well, we don't really know yet.
Mm-hmm. What are your ideas? What are Doug's ideas?
We'll get into it.
I don't know. You keep reading these dead white men. I want to hear about the the one that's alive in front of me.
I like that you use the word alive. Noticing the idealists have this fundamental, like the consciousness is fundamental to reality and how we interact with this. This seems a little monist, like it's this idea that it is all mind. It's a little bit too.
But what is mind when we're saying it's all mind? What do we mean when we say mind?
I would put that there, and this is definitely going to be, I think, the next. When I talked about earlier about like the flip, I think this is going to be the next one where we finally say, okay, not brain. Let's throw the brain ticket, put it in a trash can.
I thought we ditched the brain already.
Yeah, and we are. We're throwing it into a trash can. I think the next step is where we suddenly start to see, like, okay, we need to talk about this in a totally different way. Mm-hmm. And so how this all comes to me, and this is where I'm at with what Bowen Barfield calls the new participation. And I say it's animism.
Okay.
The universe is alive. Mm-hmm. It is a living thing, and everything in it is in some way haunted.
Whoa, spooky.
We could in some small way replace the word consciousness, both within us and within non-human persons and animals and even non-living entities and things like objects, that these things can be explained. Instead of using the word consciousness, let's use the word spirit. Animism sees us and that this consciousness or the spirit is there to complete or ensoul creation. And this is the fundamental view of magic in some level, through Hermeticism, through even Kabbalism in some respects, that we are here to complete creation in some way.
So is this kind of answering my earlier question on how consciousness is linked to magic?
Yeah. For me, I see this, and especially what's great about animism is it's never a final answer. Things remain a mystery. And by granting everything an interiority, I'm trying to stay away from something like panpsychism, which is basically says that saying like matter will eventually become consciousness. You put enough things together, and it will just become. And it's just going. I don't agree with that. It's just going back to matter. So, and why animism is for me, and for my magical view on consciousness, that is completion through embodiment. And how we participate with these appearances, this apprehension is an engagement with the worlds, the objective, the subjective, and it allows room for imaginal co-creation of reality. We need to remind ourselves that these are not one thing, and that nothing is final. And that's what's great about animism, especially within a magical context, is that it is never only one thing. And stranger aspects of reality that people would say, especially idealists would say, that are in mind, that these things, they might have their own inner life and its own purposes and its own desires. In this day and age, when we are nearly faced with environmental catastrophe, and life seeming to be going through what we can consider almost like an endpoint, which I don't necessarily believe with. I think instead of an idealist viewpoint, which kind of remains in the idea realm, stick with the animate, to an animism, the fact that the universe is in some way alive, and that spirits also in some way might have something to do with how we became conscious. When we study all of our myths, Mircea Eliade once said that all creation myths are merely just stories of how we became conscious. It's like we've somehow forgotten this in some way, shape, or form. We live in just this age where we have very little meaning, and Pascal once said, man is equally incapable of seeing the nothingness from which he emerged and from the infinity in which he is engaged. And animism,
that's interesting.
Animism, it keeps a mystery. It keeps things a mystery. It is not the end point. I think people are always trying to find that one thing. And animism contends that there is never that one thing. I think animism is the final participation. The more fruitful option than all is mind, I think. And for hundreds of thousands of years, this was the way that we lived. And so it's not a going back. Animism as it exists now is not trying to go back to the jungle or to the tribal way of living. It is an understanding, a fundamental understanding now as to your participation in the apprehension of your reality via your consciousness. And what I also love about animism is that it's, if consciousness and the meaning of life are almost the same question, but almost framed in a different way, that the meaning of life could be life. And this is there's a great book about this that it doesn't really bring up animism, and it's the same writer that I mentioned earlier. His name is Gary Lachman. He has a book called Caretakers of the Cosmos. I would say that if, on this podcast, I've suggested the first book that people should read if this is interesting to them is Cosmic Trigger 1, The Final Secret of the Illuminati by Robert Anton Wilson. A good one to read a little bit later on, once you've gone through that, is Caretaker of the Cosmos. It is a fantastic book. And I want to end the podcast basically with a small little quote from the French-Egyptian writer named Edmond Jabé, who said, "If I were asked which of all the mysteries will remain forever impenetrable, I would not hesitate to answer the obvious." And that's our show. Oh. Thanks so much for coming, Zoe, and I hope
anytime.
I hope we got to some kind of an interesting concept or two along the way. I know for a fact you don't dislike brains. Have you ever eaten brains?
I have not. No. I have seen brains being eaten. I have never been compelled to consume brains. I feel like I have enough with the normal, steak. Yeah. Steak's good.
Right.
I like steak.
Yeah, but no, brain is fantastic. And that's the episode.
So when you eat brain, do you feel like you're eating consciousness, Doug?
I do not.
No. So you don't feel like guilt that you ate, or you don't feel like you absorb this consciousness in your body that is not yours, and now you have to deal with this consciousness that isn't yours. Oh my God, what are you going to do?
Exactly. No, I do not.
That's good.
People that are interested can go to whatmagicisthis.com. There you'll find show notes for the specific episodes that we do, or that I do. You can find my Twitter, my Facebook, my Instagram page. You can find links there to subscribe on iTunes, on Google Play, on Android devices, TuneIn, Radio Public, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify. They're all there. It's great. Please head to whatmagicisthis.com, especially for the show notes. They're great, and they might lead you in an interesting direction. And all the books that I suggested will be up on there. Find them out if this stuff is interesting to you.
You might find your consciousness.
You might find your consciousness somewhere there. And with that, we're going to ask the post-show quid pro quo. Are you ready?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. So what would be the book, not the greatest book you've read, but which book was the one that absolutely reversed almost every single mental polarity that existed in you? In other words, Zoe, what book completely changed things for you?
Well, I'm reading a book right now called Radical Forgiveness by Colin Tipping. Mm-hmm. And it's about getting rid of your victim consciousness through forgiving on a very deep level. And I have to say that right now it's absolutely blowing my mind, and it's very relevant to, I think, a lot of things that I've gone through in the past and that I'm currently going through. So I would say that is probably the one book that's kind of shaking my world.
Amazing. Yeah. Zoe, thank you so much. You were a great guest. I love your fire. I love this firebrand that you have. It's actually really refreshing. Most people just sit back in their chair. You're engaged. You're actually standing on your chair. You're ready to lunge at me. Would you come back on the podcast if I asked you to?
Sure, why not?
Perfect.
Just give me the wine.
Just give you some wine.
Just kidding. I would do it without the wine.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks to you,
You're
everybody,
welcome.
for, listening. And we'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye.
All right.